I had been working at Chuck E. Cheese for 3 months already. The job wasn't great, but it paid the bills. As usual, I was taking orders, pizza, drinks, tokens for the arcade machines. Kids were running around the room, parents sat at tables studying menus or scrolling through their phones. Everything was as it always was: noise, loud music, and that constant smell of fried food that seeped into everything around. That evening, though, something felt different. I noticed it when a woman in her 40s showed up at the counter. She looked exhausted, almost tense. She was holding a photograph of a boy about 8 years old. She came into Chuck E. Cheese near the end of my shift. I was picking up scattered tokens near the machines when I saw her standing by the counter. The woman looked drained, as if she hadn't slept in days. In her hands, she held a photo of a boy. "Do you work here?" she asked when she noticed me. "Yes," I said, walking closer. "How can I help you?" She handed me the photo. It was a smiling boy around 8 years old, wearing a blue jacket. "This is my son, Nick. He went missing 2 weeks ago. The last place anyone saw him was here. Did you notice anything unusual?" I looked at the photo and felt a chill run down my spine. The boy looked familiar. "I remember him," I said carefully, choosing my words. "He was here that day. He was playing at the arcade machines with a few other kids." Her eyes filled with hope. "Did you notice anything strange? Maybe he talked to someone." I hesitated but then remembered that evening. I recalled seeing one of our regulars during my break, a man who always sat in the corner, ordered only coffee, and watched the kids. "There was a man here that day," I said. "He comes here often. Always alone, always sitting in the corner, just watching the room." The woman's expression turned to fear. "Do you know who he is?" "No," I sighed. "But he's very odd. Always orders the same thing, never talks to anyone, just watches. And that evening, I saw him leave through the back exit." It struck me as a bit odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. "Did he carry anything with him?" she asked, gripping the photo so tightly her hands turned white. "He had a large black bag. But I assumed it was trash or maybe tools for some kind of maintenance," I replied. The woman started to cry. "Have you seen him since?" "No," I said. "But if he comes back, I'll be sure to notice." That night, I stayed in the building later than usual. The back exit, the black bag, the men in the corner, it all started to feel like more than just coincidence. I decided to check the security cameras, but when I went to review the footage from that day, it was gone. I was sitting in the back room, staring at the monitor connected to the security cameras. All the footage from the day the boy went missing had been deleted, while recordings from other days were still intact. This couldn't have been an accident. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I realized someone had deliberately erased that specific data. The woman was still waiting in the main area, unwilling to leave until I found something. "We have one more camera," I told her as I stepped out of the back room. "It's aimed at the exit. If he used that back door, we should see it." I pulled up the archive from that camera. A feeling of tension gripped my throat as if we were close to uncovering something critical. And then, there he was. The same man appeared on the screen. He wore a dark jacket, his face barely lit by the dim lights outside. In his hands, he was carrying a large black bag, holding it carefully as though it contained something very important. He exited through the back door and walked to a white van parked behind the building. "Stop," the woman whispered, pointing at the screen. "That's him." We watched as the man placed the bag in the back of the van, got into the driver's seat, and drove away. I quickly noted the license plate and immediately called the police. "This needs to be investigated," the officer on the line said after I provided the information. "Stay put, we'll be there shortly." The woman thanked me, but fear was still etched across her face. She refused to leave the building, so we sat at one of the tables and waited together. Half an hour later, the police arrived. They reviewed the footage, took down all the details, and promised to track down the van. But something didn't sit right with me. After they left, I decided to check the back exit again. Beyond the door was a small corridor filled with boxes and shelves. For the first time, I noticed one particular box, a large wooden crate that seemed oddly out of place. It was partially covered with plastic sheeting. Cautiously, I approached and lifted the plastic. Inside were children's belongings, a jacket, a backpack, and even a toy car. None of these items belonged to the restaurant. My heart sank. This couldn't just be a coincidence. I immediately called the police again and reported what I'd found. After hours of investigation, the officers confirmed that the items belonged to missing children, and they opened a criminal case. They began searching for the men, and the entire town descended into a nightmare. But for me, this was just the beginning. A few days later, I stayed late in the building after closing. The lights were off, and I was organizing old boxes of toys. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, like a rustling, coming from behind the stage. I walked closer, but no one was there. Only darkness and the massive animatronics standing still. One of them, Chuck E., seemed to be staring straight at me. Then I heard it again, a sound like soft laughter. But it wasn't a child's laugh. It was low, raspy, and came from the same corner where that man had always sat. His words sounded as if he knew exactly what I was thinking, which scared me even more. The police officers nearby also noticed the man's strange behavior. "Who are you?" one of them asked sternly. The man smiled, a crooked, eerie smile that offered no comfort. "I'm just a visitor," he said calmly, sipping his coffee. "I enjoy watching people. Especially children." The officer stepped closer. "We have some questions for you. Please stand up and come with us." The man didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on me, and the coldness of his gaze sent chills down my spine. "He won't understand," the man suddenly said, his voice unnaturally deep. "You've opened a door that should have stayed shut. Now it's only the beginning." The officers, not waiting for his cooperation, pulled him to his feet, though he didn't resist. As they escorted him out of the building, he turned back to look at me. "Return it, or they'll take you," he said quietly, but I heard every word clearly. I knew he meant the toy car I had found. "Return it where? Why?" A sinister weight seemed to press down on me, growing heavier with every passing moment. The police took him to the station, but the next morning, I learned that he had disappeared. There was no sign of him in the cell, and the surveillance footage only showed him sitting and staring directly at the camera before. Nothing. I didn't know what to do. The toy car, which I had left at home, felt like the source of all this terror. But as soon as I thought about it, my phone rang. It was the boy's mother. "What have you done?" she screamed, her voice shaking. "My son is back. He just appeared on our doorstep. But it's not him. He's acting like a puppet. He looks at me the same way that man did." I lowered the phone, realizing this wasn't over. The toy car sat on my desk, and I suddenly remembered the man's words, "Return it." But where? That night, I went to Chuck E. Cheese. The building was empty, closed for the night, but I used my employee key to unlock the door. Inside, everything was silent. Nothing seemed out of place. I walked to the stage where Chuck E. stood. His head was tilted again, and his eyes glinted faintly in the dark. I placed the toy car at his feet and whispered, "I'm returning it. Leave me alone." Seconds stretched in silence, but suddenly, the lights in the hall began to flicker. Chuck E.'s head slowly tilted back, and then the final light went out. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. I was lying on the floor in the empty hall, and the toy car was gone. I quit that same day. But even now, every time I pass that building, I feel like someone is watching me. And whenever I see a toy car, my blood runs cold. It hasn't left me. And I fear it never will. I worked at a cafe on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a popular spot, quiet and cozy, but for me, it was just another routine. Sitting behind the counter, serving coffee, attending to customers who couldn't find anything better. The evenings were particularly dull, as most people came in out of habit or aimlessly, seeking shelter from the noisy world. One evening, just as I was thinking about closing up and heading home, he walked in. A middle-aged man, with a face marked by the traces of many long nights. He wore an elegant suit, but his gaze seemed out of place for this kind of setting. He approached the counter and ordered a cup of black coffee. "Is this your first time here?" I asked as I handed him the coffee. The man simply nodded, but his eyes were not on me. He was staring at the door, as if waiting for someone. This struck me as odd, since there were no other customers in the cafe except the two of us. "Do you come here often?" I couldn't help but ask. He looked at me with a smile, more mocking than friendly. "Visitors in places like this often have their secrets," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. But I didn't come here to talk about myself. This was not a usual conversation. I could feel a heavy tension in the air, as though something important was about to happen. The man set his cup down and, almost deliberately, glanced at his watch. "Don't you feel the air changing at moments like this?" he asked. Before I could answer, the cafe door opened, and a woman walked in. She was dressed in a black leather jacket, her eyes looking as though they hadn't seen the sun in years. She walked past the counter and sat at a table in the corner. Her gaze fixed on the man, and I saw something shift in him. She stood up and walked over to him, and I noticed how he clenched his fists as she sat down beside him. "Did you know I'd come?" Her voice was cold, like ice water. The man remained silent for a few seconds, then quietly responded. "I always knew you would return." I could feel the unspoken wall between them, but at the same time, everything around me seemed to grow tenser. They exchanged no more words, but I could tell that every movement between them spoke volumes more than words ever could. The woman picked up her cup and drank her coffee without looking at me, while the man merely watched her. I saw a look of something like regret cross his eyes, which he tried to hide. Then, suddenly, she stood up and walked toward the door, and he followed her. I was left alone. The silence in the cafe was deafening. I stared at the spot where they had sat and felt an odd sense that I would never see them again. Something about their behavior seemed wrong, something beyond just a conflict. In their eyes was a hidden story, and it was a story not meant for this place. A few days later, I learned they had both disappeared. No one had seen them in the city again. And while this wasn't unusual in such a city, it became clear to me that sometimes, even in simple establishments like this cafe, events unfold that leave a mark not only on the walls but also on the souls of those who witness them. Since then, I no longer work there. But from time to time, I still stop by the now empty cafe, thinking about what happened that night. And wondering if there's anything left of what I didn't see, something they took with them. The following week, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The city began to feel less familiar to me, and every corner started to look like it was hiding yet another dark secret. All of my friends noticed the change. I had become more withdrawn, as if something inside me wouldn't let me live peacefully. One evening, as I passed the same cafe, I couldn't resist and went inside. Everything looked as if nothing had changed, yet I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was different. The same tables, the same dark atmosphere, accustomed to its closed world. I approached the counter, as I had before, but something about the silence felt unnatural. Then I noticed him. The man in the suit. The same one who had sat here a few days ago with the woman. Only now he was alone, his face emotionless, and his gaze empty, like the very coffee cup he was holding. "You're still here." I couldn't stop my voice from trembling. The man turned his face toward me, and for a moment, it seemed like he didn't recognize me. But then he smiled, and it was the same crooked smile I remembered. Not one that brought peace. You're curious, aren't you? His voice was quiet, but with every word, I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't just the tone of a conversation, it was something more terrifying than any other situation. We all have our secrets, and if you want to know the truth, I suggest you stay away from this place. You're not ready for it. I couldn't understand what he meant. I tried to control myself, but something in his words sparked an overwhelming desire to know more. Do you want to leave this place? He continued, looking me straight in the eyes. I didn't respond. Only now, when I tried to leave, I noticed how everything around me had become strange, like someone or something was watching every movement I made. The men walked toward me and quietly whispered. They will return. Everything will return, and you'll be a part of it. The only question is whether you're ready to go through it. This marked the beginning of my nightmare. I went home and couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to those people, what they had actually taken with them, why it was so important to them. In every sound, in every rustling behind the walls, I felt that something was watching me. Then, one morning, I received a message. It was simple, but from the quiet words, I realized that things had become much worse. They've come. You know where to find us. Now I understood that what happened at the cafe wasn't over. And every time I passed by that place, I felt the air around me grow heavy, like gray, lifeless stone weighing down on my shoulders. What was this force pushing me back to this place? And what was I willing to learn, even if it meant the end of my story? I could no longer just watch. Now I had to find the answers. I went to the place where it all began, the cafe. Each step felt like a burden, as if I wasn't just walking through the city, but through a labyrinth where dangers awaited me at every turn. Every time I neared that place, my heart raced, and my thoughts tangled into a chaotic web. And there it was, the same cafe standing before me. The door was open, but the silence inside was so deafening that I could feel it squeezing my chest. I stepped inside and immediately felt that something had changed. This was no longer just a place, it was a monument to everything I feared. He was here again. The man in the suit. I couldn't stop myself from asking the question that had been tormenting me from the start. What do you want from me? I asked, though I wasn't sure if I truly wanted to hear the answer. The man turned and looked at me again with that same empty smile. You want to know so much, but you're not ready for the truth. You can't go back. And now, you are no longer who you were before. This was inevitable. I could feel myself losing control, but something inside me pushed me to take the final step. I moved closer to him. Do you want to know who we are? He asked, and his voice no longer sounded like before. It was as though it wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Then listen. He raised his hand and pointed toward the window. I looked in that direction and saw people, but not just people. Their eyes were empty, their movements mechanical, and they walked the streets, oblivious to the world around them. They were the ones who stayed in this place. We are those who can no longer escape, the men said. Those who allow this place to control their lives. I realized that it was all a trap. And I had long since stopped being just an observer. I had become part of this cycle. Those who were here could not leave this place. I glanced at the toy car I had brought here and understood, it wasn't just a toy. It was a symbol that I had been here, and now I would remain here forever. There's no going back, the men whispered. You are one of us now. My mind snapped. And I realized that, by coming here, I had made a decision I could never undo. I was a part of this place. My soul remained locked here, within the walls of this cafe, while the streets of the city continued on their way, as if nothing had happened. And since then, I became one of those who watch from the darkness.